How's it going?
It's going pretty good. Excited to be back for another episode.
Oh, absolutely.
For Dungeons & Dragons 5th Editions, this is going to be our episode on how to be a Dungeon Master or a Game Master for Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition.
Yeah.
So, welcome everybody to the Nat One Nerds podcast, and as I said, today we're going to be talking about DMing.
Yep. How to be a Dungeon Master.
So, what exactly does a DM do in your eyes?
He's the great facilitator.
I think that's honestly a great word for it, facilitator, because there's so much debate online about what exactly a DM does, what his role is, how much control he should have over the game. And I feel like the best way to summarize it up in one word is he facilitates the game.
Yeah. They oversee everything. They keep harmony at the table, both in and outside of the game itself. They oftentimes are also playing host.
Yeah, basically the DM is the person who organizes the game, sets everything up, hosts it, and they're the ones in charge of creating the environment, the world, and facilitating the adventure itself.
Yep.
It's really a very encompassing role. You do a lot of stuff, and that's why we decided to talk today about how exactly to be a DM. Mm-hmm. So a good place to start is what kind of things do we need as a DM to do a decent job?
Yeah, you definitely need components if you're going to be a Dungeon Master, especially for 5th edition.
I'd say probably one of the most important things is generally having a knowledge of the game. Because you're the one facilitating the whole thing running, which means if you don't know how the system works, what the rules are, how different enemies interact, you're going to have a really hard time running it. So absolutely two of the most important things to have as a DM are both the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. I'd say those two just go hand in hand.
Yeah. If you were to look at Wizards of the Coast and how they advertise things, they advertise those two books as like necessities. Mm-hmm. The Player's Handbook, which has the general rules, player character options, how the mechanics work. And then you have the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is literally a whole book dedicated to how to be a Dungeon Master for this system.
Honestly, the two together of the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide are kind of like when you get a card game or a board game and they have that paper with all the rules on it. Lump all that into one for D&D, and that's those two books. It's the rule paper for the entire system.
Yeah. You are the rules lawyer, essentially, at this particular game.
Depending on how you run the table, typically the DM decides everything when it comes to rulings on how things go.
Yeah. Because if you look at like the Dungeon Master's Guide, I believe at the very beginning of it, it clearly states that here's all the rules, here's how the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons system works. But ultimately, your word as a Dungeon Master is essentially law.
Yep.
Now, you shouldn't get power hungry with that, because if you do, you will lose your players faster than anything else.
And we'll talk a lot about DM player balance later on, but it's something that's very important to maintain at the table. Yep. But once you have read through those two books, and I would definitely suggest giving those books a thorough read before you start DMing. Like, just having them is nice, but actually read through them and give them a good study and familiarize yourself with the contents. It makes it go so much more smoothly, a lot easier, because you know what it is without having to stop and break the immersion to look up a rule every 2 minutes. Mm-hmm. But once you have those down, another one that we really suggest is either the Monster Manual or the new Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse, which is kind of like their revamped Monster Manual. It went through, rebalanced a lot of stuff, helps to bring things up to date. But generally between those two, you just need to know what some of the monsters are that you're going to be using in the game.
Yeah, because as the Dungeon Master, you have to facilitate all the people that your players' characters will encounter, the towns, environments, but obviously also the conflicts and monsters and all that kind of stuff. And both the Monster Manual, which was the first one, and then the reamped, essentially better edition, Mordenkainen's Presents Monsters of the Multiverse, which is the one we recommend because that's the more updated version.
Although I don't like how it nerfs kobolds as a player race, but that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have feelings. I mean, we've been playing the system long enough, and we don't like all the changes per se.
But that's one of the beauties of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is you can honestly play with whatever rules you want as long as it's all agreed upon at the table. So say they change something, you can still use the old version if you want, and it will not affect anyone except for your own table. Yep. So as long as everyone's okay with it, you do you.
Exactly. I like how you brought that up because because essentially what these two books do is that they have what's called the stats for the monsters and different NPCs that are typically in conflict with your players, like bandits, thieves, general enemy soldiers.
The Tarrasque.
I hope not a Tarrasque. That would suck. That's like fighting a deity monster, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's where your dragon stats are. What abilities the dragons have. What their stats are. How strong they are. Those are very, very helpful to have, and that's why we highly recommend that you also get that book, Monsters of the Multiverse, along with the other two that we mentioned, the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. But as Brandon was talking about, your word is essentially law as long as it doesn't come into conflict with the actual players themselves.
Yep, and once you have those 3 books and you really familiarize yourself with the rules, the systems, the types of creatures that are going to be in there, your job is now a million times easier because you're able to create this story for your players without having to constantly, like I said, break that immersion to check up on stuff or figure out, oh shoot, how does this monster work? You're going to know. And it's also helpful to have them present while you're playing. But once you have all of that stuff under your belt, you know exactly what you're going to need. The next thing you're going to need is definitely a story for your table.
Yeah.
Because one of the main parts of Dungeons & Dragons, or most role-playing games, is you have a continuous story that's going to run over the course of your whole adventure. And there are many different ways you can do that. You can either use a pre-written module, which there are tons to choose from. You can completely make your own or homebrew it. There's a lot of different options.
Yeah, Wizards of the Coast has definitely published a ton of adventure modules and just general source books for different worlds in which your story or your adventure or your quest can take place in. And just within the official stuff, there's so many options, and then you start getting into like third-party supplements.
Oh, third-party, there's just an endless stream.
Yeah. Honestly, if you're not comfortable creating your own world or your own adventure from complete scratch, because that's definitely a daunting task, and I wouldn't recommend that for new dungeon masters.
Yeah, the way I look at it is I like to separate it into 3 different tiers of where you get your material from. There's the pre-written modules where you literally follow a pre-written story. It's a lot easier for the DMs. I'd suggest it for beginners. But basically, you're just exploring this together with your players and facilitating the adventure for them. Next would be setting source books. For example, they have Mythic Odyssey of Theros, or there's Eberron, where they don't give you a set story, but they have a very well-established world, cultures, groups of people in these worlds, and it's easy to build an adventure out of that. And then the hardest one, but sometimes the most rewarding, is you can also just completely build your entire own world out of scratch, just homebrew the entire thing. And that can get a bit messy and difficult and time-consuming, but if you can pull it off, you can make some amazing adventures out of that. But most adventures are going to come from one of those 3 groups.
And again, if you use a pre-written module, it doesn't mean you can't tweak it. You can tweak it. You can combine modules. I have my current dungeon master. He loves to take pre-written stuff and have it slowly turn into like a homebrew thing. Like it starts off as the pre-written and then it turns into homebrew. Or it even goes from one module to a whole different module and has this interesting engineer tie in.
Oh yeah,
like taking the time to do.
For example, I'm currently running a campaign out of the Spelljammer setting, which is their newest book that they've released, which is kind of exploring the astral sea and the multiverse, things like that. And the way I'm running the campaign is basically they're going to go from world to world, and how I'm going to run that is each world is going to be a snippet from a different pre-written module, and they'll just run a chapter of that module, and it'll be kind of just like exploring a whole bunch of different ones to make their own adventure.
I will say about Spelljammer that if you're a fan of Treasure Planet, there's a good chance that you will like that setting.
It is 100% Treasure Planet made into a tabletop.
Which is a huge dream come true for me because I love Treasure Planet so much.
So, speaking of adventures, what would you say is your favorite pre-written module that you've run?
Oh, well, right now the campaign that you're in with me that I'm the DM for, we're doing the Eberron setting. It's a steampunk darker setting. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of this interesting, like, the fantasy world that's in the early stages of its own industrial revolution.
But it's like magical industry. It's not like, it's not technically like steam technology or like electricity. It's more of like arcane powered technology, which I honestly think is a really cool fusion of fantasy and sci-fi. It's just not your traditional like electronics.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a really fun setting. It can definitely be pretty overwhelming because this setting has a lot of economic and political adventure hooks to it. So if you're not well versed in economics or politics,
it takes a lot more background.
It's a bit more research. The most popular setting for a lot of Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition games is the Forgotten Realms. I would say about maybe half of the adventure modules that don't have a specific setting per se.
They just throw it in the Forgotten Realms.
It's kind of default to Forgotten Realms. And that's definitely your very, I don't want to say typical because it's definitely its own thing, but it's very, for lack of a better word, it's typical fantasy. You got your guilds, you got, city-states where there is political stuff and there can be all that, but it's not at a huge scale. You're not dealing with nations, or you're dealing with towns and cities and, unique places.
Yeah, and I think that would kind of fall under that second category of Eberron. I don't believe there are any official modules written specifically for Eberron. It's one of those, they give you a setting and you do what you want with it.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's just really one of the bigger sandboxes that they've come out with for 5th edition.
Mm-hmm. I'd have to say that my favorite one that I've run, when it comes to just using a setting, I absolutely loved the Theros campaign that I ran in college when I was up there with my wife at Idaho. Theros is kind of think mythological Greece as a D&D setting. That's exactly what it is. They patterned it after that. They even have city-states that are very similar. And it was so much fun getting to run an adventure where we go adventure through the underworld. They ended up defeating a kraken-like creature, fighting off like cults of the deep. There's so much rich lore in that they were able to borrow from Greek mythology, and it was really fun to get to play in that setting.
Yeah. So if you really want to play a satyr or a centaur, Theros.
Oh yeah, Minotaur Barbarian.
It's fun. That is the best setting. Now, granted, I would imagine a lot of Dungeon Masters would allow any race to be in almost any setting, but there are some races in D&D that are definitely very heavily tied to certain settings.
That's true.
So if you want the most out of a certain race and it comes from like a Theros book, then Theros is your best place to do that. So, because there's so many different races, even in other settings without even incorporating. So, like, Eberron has its own unique races in it that, could be anywhere else. There's way, especially with Spelljammer, the lore included in that definitely would explain why races are hopping from worlds to worlds in a sense.
Oh, yeah.
Where they aren't necessarily native, but that's still going to be really rare. So, but then again, that's where a good backstory can come from if the player's creative.
Honestly, you can do pretty much whatever you want as long as you have good story writing skills.
That's true. That's very true.
But as for totally pre-written modules, I'd have to say one of my favorite ones that I've run was ironically also up in Idaho. So if you guys have never been to Idaho, everyone has their own opinions, but in my opinion, it is a barren wasteland devoid of people. It's snowed over for 2/3 of the year. My wife dragged me up there for school against my will. And I'm a very social person. So even though we were in a little college town, I did not have enough socializing. So I actually started a one-on-one campaign with my wife, which was actually pretty fun for us to do in our spare time. but we did a module called Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden, which takes place in, ironically, a frozen tundra that's separated from society other than small towns that are connected by little, like, logging roads, basically. And it was really fun because my favorite part of that module is the fact that it's, I feel, the perfect mix of pre-written and sandbox. Meaning that they have cool little pockets of adventures, storylines, hooks everywhere that you can do, and a loose central storyline that you follow. But generally, you just kind of go wherever the players go and let them discover it on their own. There's not a central driving force. There's no... a phrase we use in the D&D community is there's no railroad there to guide them on their way. So they kind of discover it on their own. And I honestly thought it was really well balanced.
Nice. Although you may have lost any Idaho listeners that we may have had.
I mean, like I said, to each their own. There are some people that love it. My wife didn't mind it too much other than the cold. I'm too social to live in a farm community.
My family's from Idaho.
That's okay. Their loss.
Wow.
But anyways, so those are some recommendations for good modules you can have. So now that you have the rules down, you know the monsters that you're going to be encountering, and we assume you've picked an adventure out, what other materials do you need to be able to run a game of Dungeons and Dragons? Some of them are pretty similar to a player's, like, for example, dice.
Yes.
DM needs at least one set of their own dice because typically you're rolling behind a screen to help kind of preserve the immersion of the story so the players aren't constantly looking at what you're doing, because it's kind of fun to use that element of randomness to help decide what happens every now and then.
Well, if you think about it, by having that screen covering what the Dungeon Master is doing, it keeps the integrity of the immersion of the story. Because your players' characters, they have no idea what's going to happen next. Just like we, as real people, don't know what's going to necessarily happen next. If they're traveling down the woods, they have no idea if bandits are going to assail them at some point.
Or they wouldn't travel in the woods.
Yeah, but they also might not. In a fantasy setting, you never know. So it kind of helps keep the players in the mindset of their characters while they are playing.
Yeah. So, as a DM, you need at least one set of dice, although I personally recommend getting as many as you can fit in wherever you're keeping your dice, because I'm a goblin. I love my dice.
So we're encouraging addiction then.
Hey, if the shiny math rocks help you keep the depression away, then go for it.
I guess there's a lot. There are definitely worse things to be addicted to than shiny math rocks.
Yeah.
Because it's math. It's education, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're just educating people.
This is the only time that English majors would ever get excited about anything math related. Just speaking as one of them.
So, as for other materials that you would need as a DM, you definitely need something to record and take notes on your adventure, whether it's taking notes of your players' interactions, whether it's story hooks, ideas that you have. This is one of the areas where Parker and I differ a little bit. He's old school and loves the notebook and paper and writing stuff down. I use my laptop to DM because it has all the materials on it, and I just quick jot down notes as I'm DMing.
Yeah. No, definitely. Because it's important to keep track of what's happening inside the game. Because as the Dungeon Master, you need to be aware of what characters are doing, what choices they made. Because
you know for a fact that your player is going to ask you what color shirt that person was that they passed in the marketplace 3 sessions ago.
Yeah. Yeah,
and if you get it wrong, you know they wrote it down.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes I wonder if my players test me just a little bit. Every so often, just to make sure I'm still, I can still be a Dungeon Master for them. But no, it's important because one thing I want to talk about later in this episode, and I want to swing back to this, is that taking notes of what your characters or what your players' characters are doing, it allows for greater agency within the story to make it more of an interactive story, a joint written story, and to also have real consequences. So, if your character, so you have an adventure set for them, but if they don't do anything to stop, say you have a cult that is going to destroy this town if nothing is done. But if your players continually, your player characters continually goof off, then one thing as a dungeon master that you may do is that there might be a consequence to that.
The cult destroys the town.
Yeah, suddenly the cult destroys the town. They're like, well, why? I'm like, well, you guys have been, your characters have been doing this.
You guys were off trying to run your own tavern while you knew the cult was destroying the town. What did you expect to happen?
Or haggling the shopkeep or, doing what...
Typical chaotic neutral player things.
Yeah, because that's the other thing, too, is that as the dungeon master, you can do all the planning you want. I recommend not going too far into it and going too crazy with planning, because ultimately, most likely what will happen is that half of it will be immediately thrown out within the first 20 minutes of the session.
For all you know, your players could decide to completely derail it and go murder an entire town of gnomes and kidnap their children. Not saying that from experience of something someone told me, but...
And I mean, hopefully they don't. I know it's fiction, but hopefully they don't do that. But again, you never know what they're going to do.
Yeah.
You just have no idea.
So once you have the dice and something to take notes on, something that we both suggest, but is not an absolute necessity, is some form of a battle map. There's many different versions that you can do of this. There's the old school whiteboard and markers, draw it out yourself, which allows for a lot of creativity and maneuverability of the map. You could do pre-made tiles for battle maps. I've seen a lot of people do electronic battle maps where they do it like over a computer, and there's a lot of different ways. Or you can just do it all in your head in what's called the theater of the mind. It's a lot harder to keep track of specific stuff in theater of the mind, but it's fun for smaller encounters.
Yeah, if it's a small encounter, then... Or you're facing just one or two things, then... Yeah, I mean, especially if it's in a small space, then... You don't have to worry about the movement speed and stuff like that.
Yeah.
If movement speed isn't going to really... If they're going to be able to move wherever on the map, then theater of the mind could easily work. But as Brandon was saying, having that map, because the typical rule is that for each grid, it's 5 feet.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of the generally accepted rule on
and
that.
As we discussed in the player section, the average character has 30 feet of movement, which is important to use this battle map to track.
Yeah, that way people can't be like, if the story says that the ranger went off scouting, they can't suddenly be like, oh, bandits attacked the party behind me. I just magically appear and start hitting bandits. No, you're like
off doing your own thing.
You're like 100 yards, 150 feet away. Like you're far away. Like
technically, most rangers can still help from that distance, but
well, yeah, because they can use short bow or whatever long range weapon they have. But let's say the rogue did that,
mm-hmm.
and he only has like a short bow or hardly any long or just a blow dart, like it's not, so it's important. I definitely like I personally use the whiteboard, but I also have pre-made maps. I have maps that kind of show more volcanic setting or forest settings or a ruined town setting, just kind of generic things. And sometimes if you want to make it a little more immersive, then the pre-generated maps may be a really good idea. Or as Brandon was saying, the electronic version. There's lots of websites. I know Wizards of the Coast is trying to do their own thing.
Honestly, I think it looks really cool.
Yeah, it does look really cool. But I know probably one of the most popular ones is Roll20.
Mm-hmm.
They have it pretty good. But there are definitely other websites out there.
I've even seen people do them where they will actually build a screen into a table and use that to project a battle map.
Yeah. No, it's really cool. That's my ultimate dream, honestly.
Yeah.
Literally just to lay a TV or some monitor in the middle of the table as the battle map, and I can literally just pull up whatever I can find on Google Images, because...
In all reality, that map is going to make combat so much more fun, because when you're just fighting enemies and throwing numbers at each other, it gets really tedious after a while. But a battle map adds extra elements. It adds terrain, it adds cover, it adds different elements of maybe there's some civilians in the background that are hiding that you need to rescue first. There's so many things you can use that battle map for to make the battle more interesting. Yeah. Because I can say from experience that battle can drag on in 5th edition sometimes, especially when players aren't prepped on their turns. And when it starts to drag, you lose player attention and then no one's really having that much fun.
Yeah. But it's interesting that you bring that up because I think it goes perfectly into the minis. Because minis are fun.
This one is Parker's addiction. I'm addicted to dice. He loves his minis.
Well, to be fair, I have but tons of dice.
I mean, ironically, he actually has a 3D printer that he uses to make minis, and my wife and I had just barely started getting into making dice that we're going to start working on soon.
Ooh.
So it'll be kind of fun. Between the two of us, we'll be able to keep some fully loaded tables.
Yes. The power. No, I'm just... No, so when we talk about minis, we mean like generally miniaturized versions of your character.
They're technically called minifigures.
Minifigures, yeah.
Yeah.
And there are lots, if you want to customize your own, there are lots of websites like Hero Forge. I love Hero Forge for my minis. I feel like they have a really wide range of races, of, you know, hairstyles, clothing, weapons, magical effects, quote unquote. But they just have lots of options, and you can customize the height, the width, if they're fat, if they're skin. Like, you can do a lot. Because what I do is I design it on Hero Forge, and then I buy what's called the STL file, and from there I'm able to just print it myself. But you can also just simply order the figure itself from Hero Forge too. That's also an option.
Or if you want to, you could always just go to game stores, and they usually have a whole wall of minifigures you can pick from and find something that's generally close to what you want. There are sales a lot of the time. Sometimes you can even find like random toys you can use that fit whatever you're trying to do.
Yeah.
I even know lots of tables that use Legos as their minifigures.
I've actually kind of wanted to make a map out of Legos. I think it'd be really interesting, but I might need more Legos, which I won't be upset by if I do that. So
the real question is, would your wife?
I don't know. I guess we'll find out when she listens to this episode.
So, minifigures and the battle maps go hand in hand. Definitely great things to have to increase the immersion. And it also helps your players to get more attached to their characters when they have a mini that's made for that character. Although I have noticed that I personally have a little bit of a curse where every time I get a mini made for one of my characters specifically, they always die the next session. It's like a rule for me. Like, with my current character, I'm playing with Parker Vestis.
I'm glad I was nice then.
He actually made my wife and I minis for our characters, and the very next session, we were going against a warlock who used Blight on my character, which is a pretty powerful spell. And my character rolled a natural 1 on his saving throw, and he rolled pretty high on the damage. My character just dropped.
Dead.
Yeah, dead. So, thankfully, he was willing to help me keep my character in the game. But, yeah, like I said, I got my mini next session, gone.
Good thing your character was a paladin and his deity decided to be nice.
So...
AKA the Dungeon Master.
Oh, yeah. This is why it's always important to bring snacks for your Dungeon Master players.
Yeah. Keeps them from being hangry.
Last thing that we've kind of mentioned before, a good DM screen helps. I actually kind of use my laptop as my DM screen because no one can see around the sides of it, but a good screen helps you to be able to keep papers around the back for like monster stats. You can track initiative, keep information back there, hide your rolls. It's a really useful tool that's not a necessity, but we would highly recommend it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, it just keeps the immersion a lot better. Because that's one thing as a Dungeon Master is that you want it to be immersive. You know, it doesn't have to be like over the top amazing. You don't have to be a voice actor. You don't have to be any of those things. But if you make a legitimate attempt at immersion with people that you consider your friends, then it'll work out.
I mean, but if you want to make a whole game chamber in your house with the ambiance and lighting and decorations and everything, take some voice acting lessons, you can go all out and it'll make a great experience for your players, but you don't have to.
Yeah.
And that's expensive.
That is very expensive and time consuming.
But it is kind of both of our goals to someday have a man cave of D&D.
I'm just honest with people and I just tell them I want a nerd cave.
Yep, nerd cave all the way.
Yep, I've embraced it.
So now that we have all the equipment we need for a DM, let's talk on how to actually start a session. Yes. First off, you're going to need to find some players, because I'm assuming if you're the one DMing, you're not going to be one of the players as well. So, very easy way is talk to your friends. I can guarantee you'll have someone that plays D&D, You can look online. There's tons of communities of people always looking for parties to play in. There's so many resources to help you find players.
Yeah, and usually I think a good group starts with 3 players and a dungeon master.
Mm-hmm. The sweet spot for most people is 3 to 5 players, but I wouldn't really suggest going over that because the game kind of bogs down. Mm-hmm. And any less than that, and it gets really hard to balance encounters.
It's hard to balance counters. It's hard to plan everything, keep track of everything, making sure everybody feels like they're actually participating in the session. Because the more people there are, it just kind of can get hard. But yeah.
I mean, when I ran that one-on-one with my wife up in Idaho, we actually hit a really good rhythm of we had her character and I had a DM PC that kind of tagged along with her. And we definitely bumped the characters up a little bit, like gave them an extra feat, couple little bonuses to help balance them out. And then we ran it kind of like a 2-person roguelike campaign where we had to be a lot more cautious because we didn't have 4 bodies to throw at enemies.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
But it can be a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
So once you have the players, before you ever start a campaign, something that we will always suggest is doing a session 0.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So session 0 is essentially before you start the story, before you start the actual game itself or the campaign, you sit down with your players and you talk about, okay, what are the expectations?
Set your expectations, your rules, basically figure out what the players want out of it, what the DM wants out of it, how loose or strict you're going to be with the rules. Another really important thing is discussing content of the campaign in case there's someone that's sensitive to certain types of content, or say you don't like swearing at your table, you don't like drinking, or say, hey, we're going to be drunk every session. You make that up at session 0 in order to have a more consistent and fun experience.
Yeah, so it's setting. So as Brandon was trying to talk about, it's not only the expectations within the game, but also without the game too. What are the rules of the table that we're going to adhere by for the remainder of the campaign? However long or short that may be, it's completely up to everybody at the table how long they want to run it for. So just understanding, those expectations, and just understanding where the players are coming from. It's also a good place to decide what kind of adventure or story. Like, as you as a dungeon master may have really cool ideas and goals, but allowing the players to have a say in that, again, will make them more invested into it, and it starts to create a collaborative story. You as a dungeon master definitely facilitate everything. You kind of spearhead everything. But ultimately, based off the players and what they want in session 0, and then what their characters decide within the story, helps dictate what kind of story it's going to end up emerging as. So it's definitely a collaborative thing.
Yeah, and in that session 0, it's also very important to discuss expectations with the level of control the DM versus the players have in the game. Because as I discussed earlier, some groups have much more railroaded adventures where there's a set story, the players follow it, and they have fun with that, and some people really enjoy that. And there are some that go the more sandbox route, where it's just a free play, and the DM's just kind of reacting to the players' actions and building the world around them. And you can go anywhere in between those. I tend to like a mixture where there's a central storyline that the players are following, but they can still do their own things along the way and branch off into side adventures. Mm-hmm. But as a DM, this is when it's really fun to learn your players' backgrounds and feature that into your campaign a little bit.
Because that'll make it a lot easier to actually tell the story as well. Kind of as Brandon was saying, just because you have a set adventure or a plot hook, or, if there's some big baddie out there that needs to be defeated, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a completely railroad campaign. Because I think railroading gets the negativity aspect from the idea that the more railroad it is, or the more set it is, the less agency the players and their characters have. So no matter what kind of character they come up with, they have to go defeat the big baddie. That's not necessarily going to be everybody's character, because one thing I will say, kind of like in writing, any writer would also know this, whether it's short story, novel, whatever. Like in D&D, your characters start to take on a life of their own. And you as the player start to learn, my character, as much as I want my character to do this, I actually don't think they would do that. Mm-hmm. So, and I've had that before, where my character ended up almost leaving a party because ideology started to drift more and more. And I wasn't upset. People were playing to their character. And I knew the players. I knew they weren't purposely trying to split the party or kick me out or anything like that. That's just how it was. So
and I think that's an important part of also learning how to separate the player from the character.
Yes.
Because there are some times when people can take things a little too personally. And that's something else to discuss at session 0 of how involved you're going to get. Mm-hmm. Because I've definitely seen times in a campaign where, like you said, a character's ideals stop matching up with the group as much. And it honestly just makes more sense for that character to leave. That's nothing against the player. Sometimes it means they can just roll up a new character to replace them. Or sometimes it means that character can have some sort of a change or a character arc. Mm-hmm. There's lots of different ways to play it out, but it's a lot more fun and immersive to play to your character and their strengths as well as their weaknesses and kind of keep it as more of a real adventure, because no adventuring party is going to be absolutely perfect. Everyone's all gung-ho buddy-buddy. There's always going to be head-butting.
Yeah. Even when you start a campaign, so like the campaign I'm in currently, our characters knew each other before the campaign officially began. They were a specialized military unit of a now dead nation. And that's what they are. So,
honestly, it's a lot of fun.
At least they were. Then my character died, and my new replacement character is a bard, and just bards aren't usually in the military, so.
I mean, you have like the drummers in the military. I'm sure bards in fantasy, in D&D military. I'm sure bards would be there helping to buff and support the troops.
Oh my gosh, my grandpa would have been a bard in the military. Actually, he was in the band in Korea.
I mean, hey,
it kept him from seeing frontline combat. So
hey, it works.
He was that good. He just. he just had a nat 20
charisma
performance check, man. He just kept rolling really well.
So now that we have session 0 down, you know what your expectations are.
I actually will add one more thing. Sorry.
You're good.
So in session 0 is also a good time. Now I will say this too. Session 0 doesn't have to be as a whole entire group. You can have one-on-one quote-unquote session zeros with the players themselves. Mm-hmm. So one of the shows that me and my wife really love, it's a D&D actual play show. It's called The Dungeon Run, which I highly recommend for people. Very family-friendly. It just satisfies everybody. It's a great show. Their session 0 was that. They had individual one-on-ones with the players where they rolled their stats. Then and there, they assigned it, built, kind of finished. I mean, they came with an idea of what they wanted. They built the character. Some dungeon masters trust their players to just do it on their own. That's also fine. But they actually did a little bit of one-on-one role-playing with that player to help them kind of get into the character's mindset. And I actually really thought that was really cool. So just as an FYI. Or you could do both. You can do some one-on-one stuff and then
having a mix.
And then having one group session. That way everybody just then and there, clearly nothing is amiss.
Yeah, it's good to have that group discussion and set all the rules and boundaries and then talk with each individual player and kind of feel them out as well and see what they're feeling, what their character is going to be like, how it's going to fit with the group. Sometimes that's a good time to discuss backstories with the players. You could also, that could be a good time to discuss how they're going to enter the campaign, because it's kind of the DM's job to narrate how the party comes together in the first place, which is kind of a picky subject for some people. There's always the standard, you all meet in a tavern, congratulations, you're a party now. Other times you have to bring them all together one by one. You have to burn down half the town with a Warforged first. You never know.
Yeah, that's true. So, and as I said, you don't always have to be complete strangers at the beginning. Your characters could know each other. Maybe some characters already know others, but don't know the others. So, like, for instance, two people at the table could decide that their characters were already friends or already knew about each other, but they're completely strangers still with the rest of the party.
Yeah.
It comes down to that session 0, establishing those expectations, what's okay, what's not. Is romance okay? is, because that could be that could be a touchy subject for some people.
Yeah.
Like
what level of violence are you okay with in the encounters? Like, do you want the DM to describe the gory details of when you behead the orc, or do you want it to just be, you kill him?
Yeah. All that kind of stuff. And that's important. And having a good session 0 can really give you a really good foundation to work from as a dungeon master.
Mm-hmm.
So have a session 0. And honestly, I don't see why you can't have an occasional session 0. Like, just check in with your players. Hey.
Oh, yeah. Do a quick inventory every now and then.
Yeah, have a quick inventory. Like, hey, how does everybody feel about the campaign so far? Is everybody having fun? If not, what can, not only as a dungeon master, but maybe us as a group can help with that?
Oh, yeah. I highly advise keeping some sort of group chat open outside of the game, so that way people can constantly talk about stuff like this.
Yeah, exactly. So... another thing I know in some of the campaigns I've been in, people have brought up like, hey, can we do a little role playing in between sessions? Some people may be okay with that and some may not, maybe because they don't want to be bothered while they're at work during the week, or during work hours or whatever. So it's something to talk about. And not everything has to be 100% unanimous, but there has to be a high level of respect and understanding.
Yeah, it's important for the players to all kind of come to a consensus of the general field of what's acceptable, because there's always going to be some players that want to murder everything, goof off, try to do whatever they can to destroy the DM's plans, and there are going to be other players that are super faithful to the railroad and want to help conduct the train. Yeah. There's all sorts of range, and I can guarantee you're going to have both sides in whatever party you're in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's something else Session 0 helps with.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. So, as far as once you get past Session 0 is actually started, one thing we kind of wanted to semi-return to was how combat works, but from the Dungeon Master's perspective.
Yeah, so as a DM, like we've said before, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is very combat-centric. So we're going to split everything into basically how to DM during combat and how to DM out of combat.
Mm-hmm.
So... out of combat, I'd say that a really important thing is descriptory details as the DM. You're in charge of creating the world around your players, and that can help it to be a lot more fun and a lot more immersive. Instead, you can say, okay, you guys go to a tavern, get a drink, and go to bed. Or you can say, you walk into a dimly lit tavern, there's a bar fight going on in the corner as the barkeep is trying to wipe some blood off the counter from the last one, and he looks at you with his one eye as you walk in and gruffly asks, what do you want? Mm-hmm. Like, there's so much level of description you can do with your games that helps it to be more fun for the players and honestly gives them more to interact with.
Yeah.
It encourages more role-playing when you're descriptive because they know that there's that mysterious figure in the corner of every single tavern. They know that there's going to be the barmaid is being harassed by someone and that could lead to a side story quest. Who knows?
Yeah. It's kind of... or it could be a mysterious figure that introduces you to a pile of dice and tells you to roll for initiative.
Man, those ones in the abandoned altars in the forest, those ones always get me.
But with that, so let's take the intro for example, though, is that the whole idea in that description was that we were going for mysterious. That was the whole theme and tone of the setting, and that's what we aimed at. So what's this random cathedral doing? It's being overgrown so much that it almost looks like nature's rebuilding it. What's up with the pile of dice? Mysterious figure in the shadows that literally just pops out of nowhere. Maybe a little cliche, but,
Maybe you just rolled low on your perception.
I feel like I always roll low on my perception in real life, honestly. I can't tell you how many times this last few days at work that I've been stabbed or hit my head. I ran into a staircase the other day.
How do you run into a staircase?
It was one of those spiral staircases on the outside, and I was trying to get into a corner behind it to do my job for this customer, and yeah, I stood up and just reamed my head against the corner of a step.
I mean, if it makes you feel any better, I used to have a job cleaning carpets, and my boss and I would keep a running tally of who hit their head on chandeliers the most.
Yeah. The world is not made for tall people.
So... that's a little bit about running it outside. It's very loose. You're basically just there to interact with your players through the world. You decide what all the non-player characters say. You decide what it looks like. And then they interact with what you give them, and you help them to build a kind of environment together.
Yeah.
Honestly, social play outside of combat is a lot of fun. And as long as you're doing a good job of describing it to your players and helping it to make it interactive, it's going to make the entire game a lot more fun.
Yeah.
Now, when you do manage to tick someone off and you end up in combat, that's when the real nitty-gritty starts.
Mm-hmm.
So we discussed a lot of the stuff when we were talking about the player episode with how to build them and the different stats. Important things to keep track of in combat is, first off, you have your battle map, hopefully. You know what the environment is. You know where the enemies are, and you know what your players are fighting.
Yeah.
Setup is everything when it comes to combat. You can just throw stuff together on the spot, but it's a lot harder. I personally like staging combat, and you don't have to force your players into a combat scenario. You could say they go and tick someone off. Me personally, I'd have 5 or 6 different encounters pre-built, and I'd just pick the one that fits the situation best and put that in there.
Yeah, that's definitely one way to do it for sure. I'm definitely more of the improv, honestly. And again, there's one thing, I don't know if we mentioned this, but there's no one right way to DM.
Oh yeah, everyone's
session.
different.
Yeah, and again, that's where that session 0 is so important in. When you're a new dungeon master for 5th edition D&D, it's kind of a little bit of a trial by error. It really is. And whatnot. So, I literally have books right there ready to go. I have a general idea of what kind of creatures they're going to encounter in this environment, but I don't always have encounters prepared because some of them are prepared and some of them aren't. It just depends.
Yeah. Like when you throw a group of 6 zombies at the party that the player just comes in and nukes with their turn undead.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So once you have your environment set up, you know what enemies you're going to be doing. Next thing is you're going to have everyone roll for initiative. That's kind of a catchphrase of a lot of tabletop role-playing games. I think 5th edition is the one that uses it a lot. So initiative basically is the order of who goes when in combat. Because Dungeons & Dragons is a turn-based combat system. So each player will have a turn that they do, and each enemy will also have a turn, and initiative decides who fits where.
Yeah. That's really what it is. And you just take turns. Again, generally those turns are about roughly 6 seconds at most, in-game wise. And obviously in reality, 1 minute encounters could end up being an hour long.
Yeah.
Because people are taking time. Now, as it was important to, as a dungeon master, you should always encourage your players to know their class and to know their characters.
Oh my gosh, please get your players to know their characters, because as a DM, you're tracking everything other than the players, and if you have to track their stuff too because they don't know how their character works, it just makes your job so much harder. Yeah, it does throw a huge monkey wrench into the combat and makes it less fun. Because the NPCs or enemies you have, they have their own stats. They have their own motivations for why they're doing things. And to try to keep track of that. So definitely always encourage. Obviously for each person it's a little different. If there's a real problem, then you may have to actually sit down with the player and be like, hey, I really need you to read up on the class. Or, because sometimes people have a hard time role-playing, so they don't always know exactly what their character... Like, they know what their character can do, but they may not know what their character would do. And so just talking to them like, hey, well, why don't we do this? Maybe these are a couple default things to do when in a combat scenario. Is your character more of a pacifist, or are they completely willing to fight, and defend themselves? Okay, let's go off that. You can just talk to your players and help them understand their character a little bit more. Now, for any player, even more experienced veteran ones, it can take 2 or 3 sessions to start really getting into your character. It definitely can.
But if your character, but you should know pretty early on if they're more of if they're a pacifist, then they're gonna maybe they try to talk to the enemies. Like, hey, you say a quick sentence, you roll a persuasion check, see if it gets their attention at all. If not, next turn that was your action, whatever. Or if they're a fighter, then they either default to a certain 1 or 2 cantrips if they're a spellcaster, or they just have their go-to weapon.
Yeah. You know? And something that I will always suggest to the end of time to both the DM and the players is please try to figure out what your character is going to do before their turn comes up.
Yes.
Because it makes combat go so much more smoothly, so much quicker. Because if you're spending 2 or 3 minutes on each character's turn per round, your, like Parker said, 2-minute encounter is going to stretch on for an hour because you're taking 15 minutes for a single round of combat.
Mm-hmm.
But if you get a couple general ideas of what you can do, then once your turn comes up, you just say what you're doing, move on to the next person, and it makes it so much easier for everybody.
I will say that there are occasional exceptions where the fight suddenly turns super south.
Oh, yeah.
So, like, say if you're like a cleric, which is generally... They generally have some kind of healing capacity.
They're a support class, mainly.
Yeah, they are. But they can definitely fight, and if you're fighting and all of a sudden somebody goes down, suddenly your plan to attack the enemy may suddenly change on the spot, and you may need a few extra seconds to figure out. So, like, as a Dungeon Master, you just have to have that insight to understand, okay, they're still going at an okay pace for the scenario that's presented before them. Because things could go really weird. The DM could throw something really weird in the middle of the combat, too. Suddenly a dragon shows up. Well, fetch. Do I take out the bandits that are kind of harassing me, or do I worry about the freaking dragon?
Yeah, I would suggest getting out of there. But it also depends on what level you are. And that kind of goes to, like we were talking about earlier, with the immersion of setting up combat as a DM. You're in charge of everything outside of the players. So it makes combat a lot more immersive if you're actually applying strategy to the enemies. Like, because as the DM, you run all of the enemies. And it's kind of fun to give them strategies. Like maybe the goblins are taking turns firing volleys of arrows from behind rocks. It could be the bandits are ambushing them from the trees. And you could throw a dragon flying overhead just out of happenstance and see if the dragon notices what's going on.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff you can do to keep track. But just like the players, each enemy is going to have a hit point total. They'll have armor class to keep track of, abilities, movement. So that's why I say it's best if the players can keep track of their own stuff, because the DM is likely dealing with a whole host of other characters themselves that have all of their own stat blocks.
Yeah. Although, not to add more to the DM's plate, it is still a good idea to have a general idea of character class abilities.
Yeah, because there are sometimes your player tries to do something and you're like, I don't know about that.
Or because you, as a dungeon master, you didn't keep something in mind. Suddenly an encounter goes completely different how you thought it would. And I will give an example. The last session we did, I forgot that one of the player's clerics has this ability called Turn Undead. And I remember, I knew she had that ability, but I didn't realize by the time, because level 5.
So, this was my wife's character.
Yes.
At level 5, so clerics, they start out with this ability called Turn Undead, where it's kind of like they chant a prayer or a ritual of some sort, and it causes all undead within a certain radius to become frightened and they run away. Mm-hmm. But once the cleric hits 5th level, that Turn Undead turns to Destroy Undead, and any undead underneath a certain level just straight up drop.
Yeah. So I had to roll all these saving throws for all these undead because they came across a town that had been overrun by undead. And they literally all rolled really poorly. And she's like, actually, technically all of them were within the radius. I was like, and they literally all failed. And so literally they went from like 8 or 9 enemies. Now, granted, the undead weren't super high level, so I didn't feel bad about throwing a ton of enemies at you guys because I knew what level you were at. I knew you could, for the most part. I figured it was still going to be an easy victory, but this became just a silver platter victory, essentially. Now there's only like 3 people left, and they're outnumbered. And something else, actually, I will inject this too while I think about it, is that as a dungeon master, one thing even veteran dungeon masters may forget is that your enemies and your NPCs know what they're doing. If they suddenly if you have bandits attacking the party and the party's kicking their butts, those who are still standing alive, however you want to phrase it, if they're completely outnumbered and they're getting their butts whooped, they're gonna run away.
They could run. They could try diplomacy. Like, hey, whoa, let's talk about this.
Yeah, you have options.
Enemies have options too. It's not just the players.
Yeah, it's not. Don't throw stuff at your players and just go till the last enemy's dead. I mean, that can happen for sure, but that's not how it's always gonna be. You know, not every enemy is going to automatically want to fight. They also may try diplomacy. Like, if you're fighting against corruption in a city government, the politician's not going to just start attacking you with a longsword. At least not most likely he won't. Like, he can, but, you know, he's going to try other things. And so just remember that your enemies and NPCs are smart. They know what they're doing. I mean, they're smart in the sense that they're not going to automatically always do the dumbest thing. You know, if they're in danger, they're going to run away. Or if they're utterly convinced that they have the upper hand, then they'll attack with everything in their power. So like when you throw like big baddies that have what are called legendary actions in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, legendary actions or special abilities, if they want you dead, then they're not going to necessarily hold back using those abilities. Mm-hmm. They're not going to wait till, I'm almost dead, I better use my secret attack.
Legendary actions are kind of nutty. It basically lets a enemy act out of turn. You can use a legendary action whenever you want.
Yeah.
It's like their screw you abilities.
Yeah, they're not always going to be Saiyans that they're most powerful when they're the most beat down. You know, they're not going to just suddenly scream louder and suddenly gain more power suddenly out of nowhere.
It's not Dragon Ball Z.
No, it's not. It's not Dragon Ball Z. So, which is actually always my beef with that show, because like they get defeated and then suddenly they're just like, ah! And then like they're just magic.
Just yell and your hair grows and you're more powerful.
No offense to our anime fans. So
hey, I love anime too.
You guys be you. So, but that's what I'm trying to get at, is that they know what they're doing. So even if they don't know how to read or they're dumb, they're not so dumb as you might think they are. Mm-hmm. So play, definitely role play accordingly to the best of your ability.
So as for DMing, I think that's about all of our points. We had all your materials, know your creatures, know your environment, know the rules of the game, most importantly. Once you're prepared, have a session 0, and with these tools, you should be able to run a pretty competent campaign with your players. Mm-hmm. As long as you're willing to put in the legwork, DMs require a lot more prep than characters do for running the session, because you got to know what story-wise they're going to encounter, what enemies they're going to encounter. I typically do a few hours of prep each time before a session just to make sure I have everything ready. Yep. And then I throw it all out the window when the players show up. But it depends on your party.
Yeah. And definitely remember to actively listen to your players.
Oh, yeah.
So I will give one more story, again, from our last session. So one of our characters has been cursed by an item. He is cursed. And I had an idea for the curse. Wasn't anything too elaborate, but I was like, this could still be fun, right? Just because it's simple doesn't automatically make it less fun. But he thought the curse was going to be like this, and he told me all about it, and I was like, you know what? That's way better than what I came up with. And
that's one of the funnest things as a DM, is when your player has a great idea and they're like, oh, I know what you do. You're trying to do this. And you just quick write down behind your screen. Yeah, totally not. I don't know what you're talking about.
But then that's a chance for you to actually talk with the player, because especially when a player can understand the difference that the player's mind is completely different from the character's mind and what they know. So not metagaming or using player knowledge for your character's benefit. If they have any semblance of being able to separate those two, then you can collaborate and be like, all right, let's take your idea and let's roll with it and see what we come up with, And the character, although the player knows all this, the character still does not know this. So they're still going to act to their character,
Yeah, that's something really important that I don't know if we've discussed. There's a concept called metagaming where your player and your character have different sets of knowledge. And it's important to keep those separate. Like, for example, I have DM'd a lot of campaigns. So when I'm a player in Parker's campaign, half the times he'll throw a creature at us that he'll vaguely describe. And within 2 words, I know exactly what we're fighting. I know the stat block and I know everything. But I need to make sure to not play to those weaknesses of the creature with my character if he wouldn't know that.
Yeah. Now, your character could have encountered this or roll high enough or something to know that based on the backstory. Which brings me to just a couple last points here, just super quick. I won't go into too much detail. But just remember, too, that choices in the game have intention behind them and have consequences, which we touched on earlier. And then again, just utilizing, because probably one of the best things you can do as a Dungeon Master is to utilize the player's character's backstory that the player has come up with. Sometimes it's hard. It can be there's a lot to juggle, so backstories can easily be lost in the shuffle of it. But if you can remember that, this person was, traumatized by this kind of group, and in the backstory they may not go into detail like, this happened to me when I was a child, I was terrorized by this group, I never saw them again, or whatever. And then if based on what you have planned, you can be like, this group could fit into that backstory suddenly introduced, and you're like, roll a history check or roll this, see if you remember, and if they do, or you can just say, hey, you remember these people, they look familiar. All of a sudden now you have not only the quest in mind, but a personal tie-in to that quest.
Oh, yeah.
And it becomes so much more immersive, not only for the player, but for the character. And of course, it feeds into each other. The more invested one is, usually it can potentially invest the other one in.
And going along with that, it's just a general great idea as a DM to have a constantly moving world outside of the campaign. Because other than what the players are doing, the world still exists around them. There's still political stuff going on. There's still economical issues. There could be a group ransacked a town while they were out saving somebody. It's really smart to have your world evolving around the characters because it helps to keep it more immersive. And it also makes it a lot easier to give consequences to your players' actions. For example, if your players are constantly helping people, being a great boon to the local area, they're going to become local heroes. People will revere them when they come into town. They'll get discounted prices. People will be willing to help them out with stuff. Or on the flip side, if your players go and murder a whole town of gnomes, everyone's going to know to avoid them, and the guards honestly might attack them on sight at the next town over because they are now a threat.
Yeah. Or gnomes just hate you after that.
Yeah.
So I think that about covers what we kind of wanted to do.
Hopefully what we gave you was some good insights on how to begin DMing, and of course, build your own DM style. We have our own ways, but everyone is their own unique player, their own unique DM, and you have your own styles. And once you have those basics down, go and do your thing. Spread your wings and fly, and I'm sure that you will have a great time DMing for your players.
And you're going to biff it.
Oh, yeah. You're going to mess up a lot, but don't beat yourself up for it.
Hashtag life, man.
That's just life in general.
And in future episodes, we'll talk about some of the supplement items. We'll talk more about supplement books, source books, adventure modules a little bit more. Even some items that we've personally used or heard of that could potentially help you organize yourself as a dungeon master, or to make the game a little more immersive, or just more fun in general. Because ultimately, that is the ultimate goal of the dungeon master, is to make sure everybody's having a fun, good time. Yeah. And if you can just accomplish that, then you're a pretty okay DM. So,
I mean, honestly, in the end, the only thing you really need is that everyone at the table is having fun. Who cares what else happens as long as they're having fun? Because in the end, it's a game. Yeah. You're there to goof off with your friends.
Yep, absolutely. Even when they're playing serious characters, you still end up creating these weird inside jokes. And honestly, having a good group, and this is with any tabletop RPG, but I know in our experience with Dungeons and Dragons, it's just been... it's such a unique friend group that it's just... there's nothing else like it. Mm-hmm. And it's awesome. So...
Well, that's about it for our episode for today. Thanks again for tuning in to the Nat One Nerds podcast, everybody. Once again, make sure to check us out on social media at Nat One Nerds podcast on both Facebook and Instagram. We post stuff about our podcast. We occasionally have polls, getting your opinions. You're always free to reach out to us on any of those platforms or even nat1nerdspodcast@gmail.com. Mm-hmm. We love hearing from you guys, and we appreciate the support we've gotten.
Yeah. Let us know if you've played Dungeons & Dragons before. Let us know what tools you use or insights or things that you keep in mind when you Dungeon Master. So, and then hopefully we can share it with the community. So,
oh yeah, we'd love to hear what you do that we missed.
Yep, absolutely. So, I think in that case, we'll be signing off here. All right. So, happy rolling, guys.